Welcome to another episode of the Anagage podcast. So, just before we start, just a quick plug. I launched a book called In Search for the Infinite. I'll put some details in the description if you want to check it out. But today, I'm very honored to have a new guest on the show, Alexander Jech. He published somewhat recently translation on Kierkegaard. I've been thinking more and more about Kierkegaard lately. He has been a big influence on my thought, and so when I kind of saw his name pop up, I invited him for a podcast to see if he could kind of explore some themes that I think are so fascinating about Kierkegaard. So he was very kind to accept. So welcome, Alex. It's really a pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I mean, it looks like, from what I've seen, you have got a very interesting podcast. I love the inspiration for the name. Uh, I don't know. I think this is the kind of stuff that the intellectual life needs more of. People talking about these topics, and I mean, there's really you really can't limit it to an academic setting, a classroom, something like that. So I'm just really pleased to be here and to have this chance to talk.
Yeah, amazing. I agree. And so, just before we kick off, maybe just give a quick intro about yourself, like what your background is like, and then we'll dive into it.
Yeah, I'm originally from Seattle, Washington. I'm now at the University of Notre Dame, in the middle of America, near Lake Michigan, I guess, if you need a large landmark. Really, I got started as a philosopher when I was in high school, which is not the norm. But I was very fortunate. I had this teacher named Sean Mintek who he had a PhD in philosophy, but he was the calculus teacher at this school, and he was an incredible calculus teacher. We were not great mathematicians, and he got so many of us to get sort of great scores. But my senior year, he got special permission to teach a class on anything he wanted, and he taught a class on philosophy. And then for about 3 years, I tried to resist becoming a philosopher because I was like, this is very impractical. There's no money in it. There's no future in being a philosopher. But at the same time, it was possibly literally the only thing I actually was doing or cared about. Um, and it took me until the end of my junior year in college to actually become a philosophy major. And since that time, I have not looked back, and I've just gone after, Plato. Number was my first philosophical love. Kierkegaard is sort of my mature philosophical partner now, that I spend the most time thinking with, and learning from.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. Um, so a good place to start, I think, is like what exactly drew you to Kierkegaard? Philosophy is very extensive. There's a lot of people to pick from to study. Like, what exactly drew you to it? Like, was it the topics? Did you have anything before that kind of hinted at Kierkegaard's, where you kind of like, oh, maybe I should read this thinker compared to someone else? So, like, how did this get started?
I mean, like many things, there are a series of sort of random, unintelligible events. Initially, actually, I mean, as I said, I started off with Plato, which is sort of a love-hate relationship. Um, because I remember sitting reading the Republic, and I was just thinking like all of these ideas are so terrible, and I just writing in my notebook like all the reasons why Plato was wrong, and then having this revelation that Plato was winning because now I was like actively engaged in dialectic, and I was thinking philosophically, and he didn't care about this dang city. I mean, the city's never going to be, but here I am, philosophizing. And there were I pursued various other angles after that. But honestly, I found Kierkegaard completely just incomprehensible. I could not get into him. I still remember trying to read Fear and Trembling and just not knowing what was going on. And then foolishly, I picked up concepts of anxiety and I thought maybe it would help, but I did not realize yet that that was maybe the most difficult and like, most unapproachable of Kierkegaardian texts. And I just got nowhere with that. And I just set it aside. And honestly, I was really into Hegel at that time, which was, I mean, there's a long story there, but I spent about 3 years trying to understand Hegel. Maybe it was three and a half. And finally, I just had this moment where a senior advisor was talking and about his own past, and he said, one time I was a grad student, and I had this sort of this realization that either I could study Hegel or I could do anything else with my life, and because Hegel's just all or nothing. And I said, well, you know what? No more Hegel. I was like, I'm not going to understand Hegel. I just, there was always this elusive thing. I couldn't quite get anywhere. Well, no, I could get somewhere, but it was like nowhere. Or I don't know. I mean, if you've read a lot of Hegel, you know what I mean. You sort of go and then you don't know where you ended up and you don't know what you're thinking and what he's thinking. But honestly, Kierkegaard still did not appear for me until I mean, this is a very Kierkegaardian explanation. So then one summer, my summer class did not fill. I had zero students in this class. And so I was like, well, and it was just an ethics class. And, but I didn't have any students. So, I was like, well, what am I going to do? And I went to the administrative assistant and I said, is there any way we could get students into this class? I mean, there's like, is there anything I could do? It was, 6 weeks away, which seemed like very unlikely. And she said, well, I mean, we could try to put up posters, but it's not likely to work in the summer. But there's this other class, you see, because there's a guy who's teaching a class on existentialism, but he's leaving for a job somewhere else. So we need an instructor for his class. Could you teach it? And I said, well, in my head, what I said was, just take it and figure it out later. And what I said to her was like, sure. And so I took the class, and in 6 weeks, um, I just said, well, I'm going to have to pick up some stuff. So I picked up Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, and I already knew Dostoevsky pretty well, and I knew Nietzsche sort of, and I didn't really know Kierkegaard at all. And I said, well, I'm going to learn. And but that was just the external occasion. Internally, I was also in a sort of very disturbed, a very kind of disturbed emotional state. There were a lot of things in my life that didn't seem like they were going the way that they ought to, or maybe like that was true of like all of the aspects. Maybe it was something like all of them. Anyway, it was closer to all than a few. And so to then read Kierkegaard at that moment in those circumstances, well, all of a sudden, by the end of that summer, I was now a Kierkegaard scholar. And so, um, yeah, it was, I mean, it seems so improbable. And yet it seems exactly like the kind of thing that Kierkegaard would say. That's how this ought to go. Yeah. And so, I went out, learned Danish, read lots of Kierkegaard, teach him in many different ways. Um, it's a lot of fun, usually, except in one case. Um, Teaching Kierkegaard is a great experience, and got to work translating Fear and Trembling, um, mostly because of my experiences as a teacher, which I could expand on if you want. But I was really, in fact, a lot of what I've done in this realm is a response to student needs, which is sort of the flip side of it, because part of it was a personal need. Um, but as I got into it, he made me very sensitive to student needs and what they needed for their spiritual, moral, emotional development, crises they were going through. And that really guided how I proceeded.
Uh-huh. Yeah. First of all, that's an amazing story of like how you got into it, and it's just hilarious how you end up specializing, when you went to a class of existentialism, and like you have the whole canon, and like the one that you like the least, or that you know the least, now we have to, study them to get the general gist of it. And then you become, completely enthralled on it. That's just hilarious. But yeah, let's dive a little bit into the student issue that you mentioned. I found that very interesting. So like, what exactly do you think that the students need, and like, how do you think Kierkegaard can help with that? And then also, I'm curious a little bit of like, how did the translation come about? Like, what were previous translations missing? What did you try to do different? And yeah, just the whole thought process behind it.
Yeah. So this is something that in some ways I've thought about so much. I'm trying to think of the right starting point. But when I teach Kierkegaard, usually what I really want is I mean, I want what he wants, which is I want them to have a sort of inward um, experience, which they work through questions about who they are, what they care about, what it means to live up to what they care about, what it means to right. There's all these things that he naturally helps you to do to think about who you are before God, who you are in your relationships, how those function. Um, and so I've often taught, for example, one way I've taught is to pair um, Kierkegaard with a series of operas and ballets. So at Notre Dame, we have an interdisciplinary class called the College Seminar, and it should be divided between like three different disciplines. And so this is where I get to do this. And it's also has a focus on oral presentation. So students need to learn how to talk about these things, and I frame it to them this way. It's really difficult to talk about love without sounding like an idiot. It's also difficult to talk about music without sounding like a fool. And talking about dance, I mean, you really don't even like nobody even says anything, right? It's just there. And I say, well, in this class, we're going to learn how to speak about these things and not feel ashamed of ourselves. And that's how we get started. And Kierkegaard is the author who's always guiding us into this understanding of how to think about the human heart and what is going on with it. And of course, students have it's a very slow paced course in some ways. We really only read either or Fear and Trembling, and a tiny bit of either Works of Love or Sickness Unto Death or something like that. Because we're taking time. We're watching Don Giovanni, we're watching Swan Lake, and then between those, we have a whole series of other operas and ballets that we might watch, depending on my sense of my mood and their mood and what they're into. And people will essentially, I mean, okay, here's an example. I've had, multiple students, they read The Diary of the Seducer, and they think, oh my gosh, that's who I am, right? And for many of them, that's a disturbing realization. They want to be something else. Others really identify with Judge Wilhelm, and they say, this is it. This is exactly what love is. And there are those who are very troubled, and they, of course, they naturally move into the fear and trembling circle of people who have some sort of impossible love or impossible passion, and they don't know what to do with it or how to relate to the world at this point, and they are looking for a way to think through that. So for these students, I'm giving them the opportunity to think through what they're doing with their lives, and they get a whole sense of all these different things. And oftentimes they'll make meetings with me, and um, they'll say, well, I feel a bit like this and I feel a bit like that. Kierkegaard's got these three spheres that everybody talks about: the aesthetic, the ethical, the religious. And they'll say, well, I feel like I'm in all of them. And I said, yeah, that's right. Kierkegaard's pseudonyms are only one sphere at a time. Actual existing human beings are always like all of them, right? We're not that pure. We're not pure types. That's how you should feel. And then, they want to work through that. I mean, they end up places, and I'd say that's the environment I try to create. What annoyed me was having to correct the text in class because I'd say, well, that's not really what he's saying, or that's not a good way of expressing this. Um, and sometimes there are references that just didn't make sense to them or to anyone, and the note in the text wasn't very helpful, or sometimes the note in the text was really anti-helpful at times. And so you can see then eventually I was led to this point where I said, well, I'll just translate Fear and Trembling myself, and then I won't have to do that for my students anymore. Very optimistic on my part to think I wouldn't later have like things I wanted to change, which I already do. It was published in September, and I there are things I would change in the translation, and someday there'll be a second edition. I will change it, but that's how I got a lot of what is in there. The way I translated it, the explanatory notes that I put in, a lot of them are either based in questions that students had or things that I just sensed that they didn't understand. And I wrote those notes thinking about what do those students in my class, what do they need to know? What would help them to read this and not just sort of dismiss something and say, I have no idea what that's about. And that's really what guided me in doing it. Um, there's also that immense glossary, which if you buy this edition, it has a 200-page glossary, which is frankly insane. But it's in some ways it was the most difficult, and for some people it might be the best feature, um, because the glossary. Well, we should just separate that discussion. You could ask me about that later. It's a whole thing, and it was a monster to deal with. But the glossary as an idea came later. That's how I got into the translation business, though.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. First of all, I completely love kind of like the class setup that you've described. Like that sounds lovely, and it sounds true to what education should be about, like in the deepest possible sense. So that's super cool to hear. And it's also funny that kind of like I kind of like put two questions on you, but like not thinking that they would be necessarily related, but then it was exactly logical from one place to the other. And so before we dive a little bit into Kierkegaard's thought, like more specifically, maybe if you could just expand a little bit on the background. So it's like, what was like the cultural and philosophical context that Kierkegaard was on while he was writing? Like, who was he responding to? So like, what was the tradition behind him, or like Hegel and Kant and all these other thinkers? So what kind of placed him historically so that we can understand his thought better?
That is a excellent question, and the first way I'll answer it will be very true, but not very helpful. And then I'll try for one that's more helpful, but um, but also more limited in like how much I cover. So the first thing would be, the entirety of the Western philosophical tradition is sort of one way of looking at it is like Kierkegaard is very well aware of the Greeks, of everything that's been going on in modern philosophy. He's very aware of the sort of traditions of Christian thought that have led up to his moment in time in 19th century Denmark. And there's there's a sense in which you can feel You can feel these influences just all over the place. He's so widely read, and he incorporates everything into this kind of stew of his mind that's just like it's cooking there, right? And everything, the flavors sometimes of things that aren't even like there. You still like, I still sense there's like a hint of Aristotle here or something, you know? He's like, he doesn't mention it, but I feel like there's just a little taste. And that's less helpful, but I think that's true, and it's a good way to think about. I mean, he is just immensely. I had a student who once said, like, his brain is just like so big, like, and it's like that's one way to think about it. But in terms of his immediate context, um, I mean, 19th century Denmark, the way I try to explain it as a first pass to students is I say, well, think about Victorian England, because if you're talking to, English speaking students, they probably know some Victorian stuff, and that gives you some ideas about an environment. Maybe that's very educated, but also very, very tight laced, right? Very straight laced. These people are repressing their emotions, and they are very carefully guarded in certain ways, and they are very optimistic. They have a sort of religiosity, but you don't know how deep it goes. And I said, that is similar to 19th century Denmark in his time. It's not quite the same world, but in many ways, that gives you the feel of that world. And you also need to shrink it down a bit, because you're not part of the largest empire on earth, the British Empire. You're part of a very small nation, although it once, not that long ago for them, had some wider influence, had more power than it did in Kierkegaard's time. And it's surrounded by it's right next door to um, this gigantic sort of philosophical powerhouse, Germany, where you've got Kant, you've got Hegel, you've got German Romanticism, and all of those influences are just bleeding over into Denmark, one after another. And in particular, at this time, Hegel on the one hand and the Romantics on the other are both giant influences. Hegel is he believes that you can understand everything, or at least he can, and like everything can be brought together into one philosophical system. Everything can be brought under reason. God can be brought under reason. There's no mysteries that will escape. The Romantics are the opposite. They're like, man, mysteries everywhere, man, and like reason just doesn't even get into the bottom of like anything, right? In terms of the things that reason can understand, they're all boring. In terms of the things that are interesting, like reason is really limited, and it's not going to help you with any of the things that matter most to us. And that's it. Those are both caricatures, but I think they help if you don't know what those things are to get into them. And I think both of those things are going on in Kierkegaard's mind, and they're shaping him. They're shaping his education as he grows up. And it's always obvious. His opposition to Hegel is very obvious, because he brings it up constantly. Um, his relationship to romanticism's a little bit more complicated. Sometimes he seems like he's in that world, but really he doesn't belong to them either, because they tend to glorify imagination and feeling in a way that he would not. He would distrust. He would say they're getting lost in fantasies, and things like that, and they really are in some ways model for his aesthetes. Um, his aesthetes are much better romantics than he is, and they do have, they have some advantages over the Hegelians, um, but the Hegelians, probably make better citizens, more like Judge Wilhelm. And that's, I guess that's a plus in their column. So that's in terms of the environment, you could see that he's pushing back against both of these, against Hegel for thinking reason can do so much, against the Romantics for getting lost in their feelings and imagination so much, and um, and he's really bothered by the official religiosity, which is only skin deep. And I think that's a sense that he had from a probably from a very young age, that most people's religion is something a matter of words and going to church on certain days, but it doesn't fundamentally shape their lives. And those social influences are the ones I would highlight.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that. That was a great breakdown, and I really like the comparison to the Victorian era as well. Even though I'm sure there's differences, I don't nothing about kind of like the more Danish specific like cultural context that he was on. Like I never read directly on it, so that actually helps me a fair bit to like try to get a sense of how that was like. And then here you also mentioned kind of like how he was influenced by this like cheap religiosity, let's say, and something that always made me so fascinated with Kierkegaard was precisely that I think, I mean, maybe there's some other thinkers that I'm not, that just aren't occurring to me right now, but like I think Kierkegaard is probably the philosopher that is the most interesting to read about his personal life and then seeing his personal life reflected on his philosophy. And I just think that's absolutely fascinating. Like maybe like in your opinion, like what do you think is the biggest link between like the personal Kierkegaard, like how he experienced life, the troubles he went through, his personal suffering, and then how did that came about in his philosophical works and his philosophical system, let's say, even though it's not a system in the Hegelian sense, but you know, in the worldview that he tried to present.
Yeah, that's those are giant questions. We could You could do a whole semester answering that. I have taught it that way. But if to break that down into something a little smaller, I mean, you're right. I mean, it's not usually the case that the personal life and the work are so intertwined. Kierkegaard himself notes this when he has to sum up his authorship. And he says it's sort of this weird fact. It's this sort of weird fact that he says Providence takes what is personal for him, and when he sort of works through the things that are personal, they become universal. Right. And he says this, and he says, but he says this is also the way it was for Socrates. That Socrates also, he really just had like personal intellectual problems. But then it turns out it's like the birth of like Western philosophy is like Socrates' personal problems. The fact that he just can't figure out if he knows anything somehow generates so much. But for Kierkegaard, they are in some ways much more personal. Um, and I would always go to three things. Number one, his relationship with his father. And there are some biographies that really like make this like the one thing. I don't think you can do that. I don't think you can take any one of these factors and treat it that way. But his relationship with his father was very difficult and yet very you can't sum it up as either a negative or a positive relationship. His father was a serf who at sort of in his teenage years was taken into the city and went like pure rags to riches, right? He was a serf, he had nothing, and he was, essentially minding the animals in a remote area of Jutland with, like nothing, just and utterly, I think, depressed about his life. And then he became essentially a millionaire, one of the most successful businessmen in Copenhagen. And he retired at 40, right? Just absolutely. And now you might wonder, like, well, what's he doing when he retires at 40? Well, he's taking a very active hand in raising his children, which has its good and its bad side, because this guy's got this very kind of dark religious mentality. the kind of mentality that is very, very influenced by the sort of this sense, the weight of sin, the weight of guilt, and is doing everything he can to sort of help his children. And yet, in helping them, actually passing on this deep sort of weight of sin and taking away from them in many ways like the sense of childhood. And Kierkegaard was the seventh child and the last. And he said he suffered greatly from the fact that essentially he never was young. Even when he was 8, he was treated as if he was, in some ways, an adult, and have this adult sort of way of relating to all of these things, which was impossible for a child to have. And he said that's one of the things that really cursed his life in some ways. And his father was just so gung ho on this. And you can see what you would get from this. The father being so involved, they were all sort of well educated. They went to these great schools. It's almost like you're going to the elite prep school and you're being homeschooled at the same time. You're getting so much. And there's this little bit too where apparently the clothes that he wore. I mean, I don't know if you have this in Europe, but there are definite stereotypes about what homeschoolers dress like. They're not really totally true, but they are based on a certain era of these sort of this idea that people who are keeping their kids home and teaching them themselves are also dressing them in this sort of traditional, like almost 19th century garments. Well, that's what his father was doing, except it's sort of 18th century garments. And he's going to school in them and getting made fun of for, the weird out of fashion clothes he has. Um, so I mean, so there's a lot going on there, and the father, his oppressive. I say oppressive, but there's something odd about it. Because Kierkegaard honors him because he's always trying to do the right thing, but it's just way too much. It's way too much weight for them to bear. Um, and so that is the first factor. And there's so much in there. I mean, you can see too, I mean, Kierkegaard's sense of like the depth of his father's religious feeling versus what he sees outside, right? You can see there that he's already going to be very aware that most people do not take religion as seriously as his father does. And for a while, he's going to be one of the people who doesn't. When he's in his 20s, he's going to say, well, then yeah, I'd rather not be religious. That seems like an easier way. And the second factor is, what sort of ends this period of rebellion. I mean, I think honestly, his rebellion period is pretty. Somebody should make a sitcom out of Kierkegaard in his 20s. I think it would be really funny. He does a lot of crazy things in his 20s when he's rebelling against his father, but he's doing so in a kind of over intellectual way. Maybe it would be like Seinfeld or something. But what ends that is, of course, his relationship with Regina Olsen. This girl he meets at a party. He falls deeply in love with her. I mean, the way he puts it is that he allowed his existence to become ever more entwined with hers. Um, Although he never let on to her that this was what was happening, because he had become an expert, partly through his father, partly through other factors, in dissembling. He never presented his genuine self in public. He only presented a sort of wisecracking polemicist, and he was known. Right, if you had him at a party, you knew he would be very entertaining, but you hope you wouldn't be the target of his jibes and attacks. That was what he was like. It was very. He had become, and as he remarks in his journals, like more than once, he was a real expert at just not letting anybody know what he thought or what he felt, and he presented a version that did all these things. And so when he fell in love, it was the same way. He did not tell her initially anything about this, so that she had no real knowledge of whether he cared about her or not. In fact, for a long time, I think you would say that she didn't believe that he did. And then later on, he always kept out the possibility that like he just never fully revealed. Maybe he didn't know how to. Um, uh, he didn't. And that relationship, of course, became very unhappy as soon as it became happy, right? Because what happens is um, one day, sorry, let me stop that. One day, um, so he's finished off his dissertation finally. His father has died. In fact, he said, so sorry, let me just add this like little side thing. He said that when his father died, it became harder for him to put off his studies because he had taken almost 10 years to finish a degree that he could have finished in 5. And it was only, but essentially, as long as his father was there, he could always give his father excuses. Right. And when his father was dead, he said, there's nobody except myself. And so he sort of switched gears for that reason and others. He finished his dissertation, and then he goes to see her, and he finds her coming back from some lesson to her house, and he asks her to play the piano, and she gets out the music, and he grabs the music book and he throws it, and he says, no, it's like it's only you that I care about, and he proposes to her in this like very weird way, and she's just completely dumbfounded, like, where is this coming from? Because she didn't know that this is where he was, and and she's like kind of dating this other guy, and he's like, that guy sucks, let's like forget about him. um and ultimately she agrees. Her father agrees. They're going to get married. And then Kierkegaard realizes this is a terrible idea because he is a terrible person. Um, and in particular, it's due to factors. I mean, his relationship with his father is a major reason. I mean, he's acquired this whole thing of presenting a fake version of himself. He has this like deep unhappiness, this sort of self-tormenting depression. And he's like, oh my God, if I marry her, she's gonna have to deal with that all the time. And I can't just hide it. Okay, because that's what he's been doing, right? He doesn't engage with her and show her himself. He shows her this very entertaining version of himself. He's like, well, that's not what marriage is like. You're married, you're actually around them all the time. And so in his mind, there's two options. Either um, just lie to her and continue to deceive her. And he says, well, he's like, I would rather murder her than like lie to her like that. Um, you're like, well, that's a little strongly put, Kierkegaard, but okay. Or right, reveal everything and crush her. That's what he adds in his mind, right? In his mind, revealing everything about who he really is just going to crush her and ruin her life if she has to live with that on a day in, day out basis. It might be romantic to imagine having this like sudden, like him telling her everything, and then she'd be like, "Oh, poor Seren," or whatever. I don't know whether she was the kind of person who patted somebody's back and said, "Oh," but he was like, "Yeah," but on a once that becomes something that goes on and on for years, it's not so romantic, and he thinks it'll ruin her life. And so the third factor which has already really been woven through here, is the fact that he does everything indirectly. I mean, that was the skill he learned of dissembling and hiding himself, providing a false self. But whereas before, he really just kind of did this as a mode of self-protection, after this moment where he realizes that the most likely result of his engagement to Regina is going to be ruining her life, his indirection becomes outwardly directed. Now he's focused on, how could I get her out of this relationship as undamaged as possible? Right? He's like, what would help her to like just forget about me and move on with her life and be capable of happiness with another person? And he comes up with this elaborate scheme right? Where he's going to slowly sort of make her feel that he's becoming distant. He's going to make himself seem to be a much worse person than he is. He's going, right? He's going to like he's going to like say these like terrible things to her to make it sound like he's just this like unfeeling, selfish person. And he's doing it because he wants her to think he's a terrible person and that she got off lucky not marrying him. Right. And so he's got to do this and be a scoundrel. And at one point, he tells his brother Peter, um, so as a sidebar, of course, of the seven children, only two made it past 33. And it's not because of infant mortality, which is what we're used to, right? This is no, these are right. These are wealthy people. Their father was a serf, but he's a millionaire now. With he certainly has all the care they need. They're not dying in infancy. They die through a series of. I mean, some of them make more sense. The girls tend to die in childbirth or after through complications from childbirth. So they make it. They make it to sort of 20 or so and 20 something, and they die. And the brothers die in a variety of ways. One of them dies in New Jersey, which really doesn't seem to make sense. I mean, you're like, what happened? Did he run into the mafia? And it's like, no. He did have a hard time. Just I don't know, just got sick and died there. Um, Again, bad relationship with the father was part of that. In his final letter back, of course, he talks about his love for his mother, not for his father. And then that brother dies. So Søren and Peter are the only ones left now. And they all universally believe that they're about to die at any moment. So that's another thing. They've inherited this like sense that that's going on, and there's only two of them left, Peter and Søren. And at one point, Peter there's some, I guess, Kierkegaard is worried that he's going to tell Regina and her family that he's lying to them, right? That he's not really like this, and he tells his brother that if he reveals the deception, then he'll shoot him. I don't think he actually would, but he certainly felt that way. And that is then the same kind of like all this indirection is also what goes into writing Either Or, his first great book, in which, right, supposedly there's this guy named Victor Aramida who finds these manuscripts in a desk in a hidden drawer and he publishes them. And there's all these different people. There's this aesthete that we call A. There's his friend Johannes, the seducer, who has this diary, which is really awful. And there's this friend of the aesthete, the judge, Judge Wilhelm, who's writing to the aesthete and saying, shape up, get a job, get married, be a productive citizen. And there's a sermon by the judge's friend who is like he's a priest like out in the hinterlands, um, preaching to sort of farmers and cows. And they're all in here, all these things. And you'll notice, like, and there's you're like, where's the authorial voice? What's the perspective I'm supposed to have? He just leaves everybody hanging, and that's itself a very complicated. It's a very complicated story to work out, but that's an example of the indirection that he is using. And I'm only going to talk about one part, and this will finally get to your second part of your question about how his personal life influenced his authorship. Because one thing he wanted to do with Either Or was to utterly repel Regina through the seducer's diary in particular, right? By depicting this guy as this like terrible, cunning seducer who's just, I mean, he's utterly devoid almost of a self. Um, right. He's spent so much time sort of deceiving people and simulating selves that it's not even clear he has a self left, or at least not one that he knows behind it all. And he works into this diary little details too that sort of are that either sort of recall or are very similar to events in his courtship of Regina, right? And he depicts he describes himself during this period as essentially going down to hell to find the devil's own secrets, right, in order to write this thing. And what really gives him the motivation to do this is he's got to go and persuade Regina that he's absolutely appalling. Because even though this is published anonymously, right, it's, well, not anonymously, pseudonymously under the name Victor Aramida, right. And so I mean, how quickly did people know it was him? I mean, some people suspected, other people had other ideas. There was a big tradition in Denmark of publishing this way. I mean, people would publish anonymously or under pseudonyms. They do all kinds of things like that. I mean, it's a fun practice if you get into it. Um, but there's one person who definitely knew, and it was Regina. Regina knew, and must have been very disturbing for her, or at least that's what he hoped, right? This would repel her. And you see what's going on here is that somehow his desire to help her, whether even though it's kind of misguided, is now being channeled through his constant hiding. And he needs to reveal and hide at the same time. He's not thinking about himself. He's now thinking about another person, this individual that he wants to reach and have a specific effect upon. And he does all of this. He produces it all. And of course, the result is actually um, she's she's not deceived at all. Not only does she know who wrote it, but when he sees her in church, and not intentionally, but he does, and she gives him this look from which he comes to realize like it was all wasted. She totally sees through like what I'm doing. She understands like I'm just trying to drive her away. It's all out of like self-torment, right? She knows I'm this. I mean, anyway, right. It was a waste. He's not helping her at all because she's not as easily deceived as he thought. And then but that after that, that's always like the drive, that's always the impetus, that's always the way his genius works. Um, is this needing to work through his problems in this indirect way. And that's part of what makes him so fun, so frustrating, and like endlessly interesting is the sense also, I mean, sometimes that maybe there's a path through all these like mazes he creates. And sometimes you wonder if even he knows like the way through them. Um, and I don't know, it's a terrible amount of fun to do that when you don't. I mean, I imagine that if you were Regina, it's not so fun. You're just probably moved with pity by the suffering that he must be subjecting himself to. But for us, we learn a lot without having to have that personal degree of connection to it. So that's my short version of an answer to that question.
Yeah, amazing. That was a great answer and just beautiful. I think you captured like a lot of what's so interesting about him. Now, something that to me personally that I found utterly captivating about Kierkegaard was also that I saw a lot of things like reflected in my own life, which I think is kind of the very point of Kierkegaard. And one of the things in specifically was number one, kind of like this awareness of your limitation towards the ideal, like the weight of your shortcomings. Um, and then also like this idea that you need something to get out of it, which faith is one way to put it that he talks about. But one thing that I found very interesting was I also saw, just like he did, I also saw this problem of kind of like feeling awful about yourself, about limitations in the context of being in a relationship with another person. Because like, if you're such an awful person, then how can you possibly justify being with another person? Like, you're gonna ruin her life, basically, or his life, whatever, right? So that was exactly Kierkegaard's dilemma, and that was exactly my dilemma as well. Like, I literally thought about this like every day. in the context of a long-term relationship. So when I read Kierkegaard, I was like, holy crap, this is me, right? The exact same thing as like a lot of your students mentioned. But then what what saved me a little bit outside the relationship was the fact that this aspect of having faith that um, that my limitations are justifiable, that they're kind of like forgiven in one sense. And obviously, there's a lot of Christian theology, but let's not go over into it. But it's just like a faith that my existence is justified and that I can move forward. And then if that's the case, then I can also apply that to my relationship. So it's kind of like I don't see how I can justify this, but like I'm gonna have faith that it does somehow. And what I find so weird about Kierkegaard was precisely that he was involved in all of this. He talked so much about this faith, about this leap towards like the overcoming of your limitations. But then he didn't do that in the area that mattered the most, right? Like it's like he had this huge problem that applies to all areas of life, and then he said, "Here's a solution," but then he didn't apply it himself. Like, does he ever like unpack this like contradiction in his work at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question, and a really nice setup, because I think the more honest we are with ourselves, the closer we get to that realization that you're talking about. Um, only once you get there, how do you get out? And I personally think really, I think it's very hard to take our limitations and flaws too seriously until you see them impacting somebody that you love. And I think there's something about that that really does. When you're sort of just dwelling on yourself in a kind of lonely way, I mean, that's awful, but that's not the same as loving somebody and wanting the best for them and then seeing that you're undermining that for them. It's just very different. Now, I think this is also a domain that people have talked. Many commentators have talked about this aspect of Kierkegaard, and somehow a sort of false story has gradually taken hold that is simpler than the real story, and the real story is just more thorny. But the too easy story is okay. So right, that moment when he realizes that Regina's not fooled, he writes Fear and Trembling. Right after that, like in just like one of these like genius storms, I mean, this is what happens to all great geniuses. They have these like moments sometimes where suddenly like the creative power goes like, goes to 11, and all of a sudden they just produce something, maybe their greatest work in a very brief amount of time. And not only does he write this, he also writes Repetition, which is another book about a failed relationship. And those are both prompted by this realization that he hasn't spared her anything, that what he's done has not helped. And in his journal, what he says is that at this time, what he writes is, I lacked faith in my relationship with Regina. He's like, thank God that I see this now. Um, Now, I lay that out because the story that developed looks a little bit too closely at Fear and Trembling and applies it backwards, in a way that doesn't quite actually fit what happened. So in Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard is concerned with the example of Abraham. And everybody knows some version of the story of Abraham. As he says, he's like, Abraham's like so famous that the real problem is everybody thinks they know stuff about Abraham, and you need to peel it away to get at the core of what is really happening. But the story of Abraham is briefly, he's living in the city of Ur. He gets called out. It says, and God said to Abram, because he wasn't Abraham yet, he was just Abram. And God said to Abram, go out from Ur and go to a land I'll show you, and I'll make you a mighty nation there. And of course, there's all these things that are sort of making this sound like an insane project. I mean, number one, his wife is barren. Like, how is he going to have children? But he just goes with her. He goes with Sarah, and he's going to a place where he has no friends. He has no network of like relations. This is a time where that is how you that's where like your whole support network comes from. It comes from your kin group. He's going to go out into the middle of nowhere where he doesn't know anybody. How is he going to make this work? Well, the idea is, well, that's the beginning of faith. And he has many little adventures and problems along the way. Sometimes he comes off very well in these episodes. Sometimes he looks like he's doubting and he comes off rather poorly. But at the end, the promise has finally been fulfilled. They have the child, Isaac, in their old age. And then at some pointed time later, it doesn't say how long, um, right? This is sort of the final episode in Abraham's life. God says to Abraham once more, he comes to him and says, go, take your son, your only son, whom you love, up to the mountain where I will show you and offer him to me as a burnt offering. Right? It looks like God's just reversing everything. Right? He's saying, like, okay, I promised you this child, but I'm taking the child away. Not only that, I promised that you would have all these descendants through this child. And this has been a big thing for Abraham because there was always this thing like, well, what if I just like, he's like, what if I instead had a child with my wife's handmaid or something? Or what if I just adopted a child? And what God says is like, no, you will have a son through Sarah. It's going to be that one. And it's only that one, right? It's only Isaac. That's it. And so here he is. He's like, okay, go. It makes Abraham's life look like the whole thing is pointless, right? This is what Fear and Trembling is driving at. And yet what happens is Abraham believes as he goes back and says. Some translations say he had faith. I think that's really not, it's one of many little changes that I really didn't like. I think it's better to say Abraham believed. That's the way he's had, because it's an active thing. He's actively doing it. He's just Abraham believes. What he believes is not always clear, but Abraham does it all. And in some sense, he always believes it's going to work out, right? He's going to take the knife. He's going to, right? He's like, he's there. He's on Mount Moriah. He's got Isaac there bound. He raises the knife and he still believes. He believes what? He believes that somehow it's all going to work out. And then God provides a ram for the sacrifice, and he sacrifices the ram instead. And they all go back. And in Fear and Trembling, he's got this pseudonym, Johannes de Silentio, John of Silence, or Silent John. Is what I like to say in class sometimes. You're Silent John. He's telling us a story, but I mean, what a paradox that is, Silent John. But this is a paradox too. I mean, why didn't Abraham go crazy? How did he not lose his mind in this episode? That's the question. I mean, here's the thing. He's devoted his entire life to this. He loves this son more than anything. And now he's like, he's going to sacrifice the son, but he still believes it'll work out, and it does work out. And Abraham's fine. And so what people have then said is that, well, okay, so at the heart of this, you could say, well, here's this weird thing, right? It looks like Abraham's going to murder an innocent child. That looks bad. Okay. And this is one of the central problems of Fear and Trembling. It's called the teleological suspension of the ethical. But the main thing is it the case that when you're following God, normal rules don't apply? Okay. Is that okay if like God says, go murder your son? Then you're like, all right, okay, God, that's fine. Is that the way it works? Except I said it jokingly because that's easier than to talk about it earnestly. But then people apply this and they say, so Kierkegaard, what he did is he broke his engagement with Regina, and that was him sacrificing Isaac, right? And he's writing Fear and Trembling to try to justify himself. He's saying because he had a higher project, it was to become an author, right? And people also tell stories about people like Gauguin or something. That story is also wrong. That's actually not people, but people get attached to this story too, where he became a great artist. He abandoned his family and became a great artist in Polynesia. And now we justify him because he became a great artist. That story is also not really quite like that. He had a lot of problems with his in his family life before he ever went. But in the case of Kierkegaard too, it's not really the case that he viewed himself as having faith like Abraham, and therefore he sacrifices his relationship with Regina. That's really backwards. But this idea has taken hold, and over the last century is like almost the dominant way that people think about it. And it seems weird because breaking an engagement doesn't seem a lot like raising a knife to a child. But in 19th century social mores, that really wasn't done. Breaking an engagement was very frowned upon. You were essentially violating an oath, right? I mean, it wasn't quite like that because essentially you'd made a promise to make an oath. But I guess, a promise to make an oath is also kind of like an oath. And if you break the promise to make an oath, then really, I mean, where's society going? And that's so it's scandalous that he did this. Um, and then this false story is, but he's like Abraham. He's fulfilling his mission to God. And you have to see that the actual way he's thinking about it is the opposite. He's not like Abraham. If he had been like Abraham, he would have married her. And that's what he says in his journals. If he'd had faith, he would have married her because he was tormented by this sense that he would destroy her, right? To him, marrying her is sort of raising the knife, right? And if he'd had faith, he would have believed that somehow, though, God would have blessed this because he did genuinely love her. And somehow it would have, who knows? He doesn't know how. That's the thing. When you have faith, you really don't know how this is going to work. That's central to it. Otherwise, it would just be, it'd be sort of reason or probability or, like this always happens. Um, but it's not. And he really would have no idea how that could happen. As far as he can tell, anybody being married to him should suffer a lot. And so essentially, his whole like this is where it's like the like commentators, it's like this tightrope. It's so easy to just fall off. You could do something so like one famous author, Martin Buber, has this thing about that for Kierkegaard, God and Regina are like rivals, and so it's God or it's Regina. But there's a sense in which you could see why he said that because it is by breaking with Regina that he became close to God. But it wasn't because there was an either or. It was because he realized in breaking with Regina how far he was from faith. And so essentially, everything he's doing is, in some sense, an outgrowth of what he now knows he should have known, but he did not know. And and there's a sort of a sort of sad story about, well, why didn't they end up getting married? And in some sense, yeah, I think he still at that time he wrote Fear and Trembling. I think he still thought that was a possibility. By the time it was published, he knew that it wasn't because that boyfriend that he told her to not to like forget about, she was now engaged to him. And it's even the case that she thought she had his blessing for this because the dangers of indirect communication are that sometimes people don't. Sometimes communication miscarries. And they had this like little exchange in the church with nods. And there were like three nods or something. And he thought he knew what she was saying, but she was, see, she had advertised that she was now engaged to this other guy. All right. And when she was doing the nod, she was trying to see, do you want to like cancel your claim? Is what she was asking him. She's saying, do you want to cancel that claim? And I'll marry him. But if you still want me to wait, so she's trying to nod this way. Kierkegaard thinks it's some other thing, and he nods and he does all this stuff. And then she goes and gets married to this other guy who has the amazing name of Schlegel, which I've got to say, like Hegel already, it's kind of a rough name. I feel like Schlegel is the Schlegel is the most unesthetic name
Sure,
I
sure.
know of.
But I actually didn't know that he kind of reflected back on the situation like that, which I think to me that's actually quite beautiful because that actually kind of that level of self-awareness, the fact that even if it took a while to like sink in, to me that actually like justifies or exemplifies his philosophy a lot. It's of like saying this is this is how life is. This is the fact that sometimes you have to make this jump, and I failed to do it, but now you need to do it. Like that. That's kind of like how I think it's the best way to see it, and I see it somewhat um, kind of confirmed, I suppose, to some degree, but based on what you said. Um, Yeah, and also it's funny that you mentioned Abraham because I wanted to mention that as well in terms of the theological suspension of the ethical. So in regards to that concept, like eh, it's a bit weird to me because every time I look into it, like I often vacillate between like two opinions. One of it, one of them is like this makes absolute sense. Kierkegaard is a genius. This is like the most accurate description of reality humanly possible. And then the other one is like, actually, no, this doesn't make sense. And just my brain just switches between on and off. And so I'll tell you like how I see it to some degree, and then like try to maybe correct me on where I think I'm misinterpreting Kierkegaard. So one of the ways that I think is really useful is that there's a call of the ultimate of God of the divine that instructs us to do a certain type of behavior, and because it's God, you need to do it. Like that, it has like maximum normativity humanly possible. But then the specific behavior that you're supposed to do, is immoral, like you described, right? So like you're not supposed to kill, which is the commandment that God told you that is now violating the last thing that God told you, right? So there's this contradiction, and so to some degree, Kierkegaard's answer is, you need to follow the theological command above the ethical commands, and to some degree, like in a typical religious context, and I think especially within like a modern interpretation of Christianity that makes a lot of sense because God is this like powerful being that is just like sending orders down to earth or whatever, right? So in that sense, it's like you can't disobey an order from this like super being, right? But then, so in that sense, that's one way to view it. Another way is that the reason why you need to maybe let me put it another way, which is like one possible criticism against this interpretation, especially from like new atheists, let's say, can be like, okay, but even if it's God that's instructing you to do that, then you shouldn't do it, even if it's God, because it's immoral, right? So, and obviously this has all kinds of philosophical history of people arguing stuff like that, right? But then the problem is that if you go far enough back, like that doesn't make any sense because God is almost by definition the ultimate good. Like you can't just say that God is going against the good. Like that's just incomprehensible. Like I think, at least in my perspective, if you go deep enough. And so, and to me, that's kind of what solves the paradox somewhat, which is like you trust that you can go against the ethic because in one sense you're following the ultimate ethic. So it's like it's just a matter of perspective. Like you just can't see behind the trajectory that you're going, right? And so that is what justifies his behavior. Is that knowing that he's following the ultimate good. Now the problem is that where I get sometimes confused is that where then I think actually doesn't make sense is because if that's the case, if you justify the theological by being the ultimate good, which ultimately ties to ethics, then you kind of end up blending the ethical and the theological. And then this hierarchy doesn't exist anymore. And then I feel like my brain just falls into mush and I'm not sure what to think about anymore. So help me, please.
Yeah, well, that's, I mean, he does talk about the where he has this, the pseudonym Johannes de Silentio saying, thought is paralyzed when it gets it gets into this, and it sort of just loses its and I think if I've got it right, that the word he uses to me, and I cannot remember the Danish word, but it's cognate with The English word lame in the older meaning. For example, a horse could go lame if it's running and then it occurs some sort of injury, so it cannot run anymore, right? Which I thought captured the sense that you're like pressing thought as hard as you can, and then it just breaks, right? So it's not just that it's paralyzed, and I don't know, maybe you um like I don't know, maybe it was an effect of some Pokemon you're fighting, and the Pokemon has a paralyzing effect. No, this is something more like the horse that's straining and then something broke, something snapped, and you don't have the ability now because of something to grasp what is going on here. Now, I will say, so this I guess this gets me into why I translated the way I translated, and some very particular issues. I don't think first I'll say I think there's no way to just snap your fingers and dissolve the difficulty of what's like going on in Fear and Trembling, in Problema One in particular. I think there is no way to do that. I think if anybody comes in and says, I've got this way, it just explains away the paradox, then something's wrong. I do think that you can try to understand the paradox correctly, and eventually you may be able to get to the point where you could understand it the way that Abraham did. And if you can get to that point, then maybe you can live with it. But so the key little bit, this has just has bugged me now for years, was in Problema One. Every single English translation, with the exception of the very first, um, sort of made a mistake in the setup of the problem. Um, Now here, hold on. Let me bring this up. I can just bring this up. I've got a document with all of these listed. Let's see. Yeah, well, actually, I was working on this yesterday. Let's see. Okay. So here's how Problema One begins in the Hong's translation. And I will say, of course, all honor to the Hongs. I'm here at the Hong Kierkegaard Library. There are busts of both of them, of Howard and Edna Hong, who together brought us every single thing that Kierkegaard wrote in English. And because English is so widely used, this is the edition that is used around the world by people who do not have a specific version, which means most people, because the Germans are very good at translating things very systematically. Um, and beyond the Germans, I'm not sure if anybody's totally done it. Um, Usually you have like something like the Italians. There's a guy named Cornelio Fabro who was, like many people, deeply upset during World War II. Um, I mean, imagine being an Italian and not being into fascism. Well, apparently what he did is he read a lot of Kierkegaard, and then he translated Kierkegaard, and so he was just this sort of one man Kierkegaard translator. Um, anyway, but the Hongs are so important, and so so I start with their translation of this, and for the most part, it's very good. But I'll get to that. I'll get to the problem. Here's how it starts. Um, the ethical, as such, is the universal, and as the universal, it applies to everyone, which from another angle means that it applies at all times. It rests immanent in itself, has nothing outside itself that is its telos, but is itself the telos for everything outside itself. And when the ethical has absorbed this into itself, it does not go further. Um, all right, so he's saying, like, look, the ethical is this thing that just applies to everybody at all times. Okay, I mean that's the simple version, and there's not some like higher point like you do what the ethical says so that you can get brownie points or something. You don't do ethics so that you no. I mean the point is that it's about what's good and bad and right and wrong, and that's just the end of the story. There's not another story. Okay, so and that's the perspective of ethics. Okay, that's fine. There's no problem here. And then he starts to talk about the individual, and the individual's task. And so I'm going to go down a little bit. And he says, as soon as the single individual asserts himself in his singularity before the universal, he sins. And only by acknowledging this can he be reconciled again with the universal. Okay. And that's so you have this business about every time the single individual asserts himself in his singularity before the universal, right? And you can see here the idea is that, well, okay, here's what we're supposed to do: don't murder. But well, I'm just gonna do it. Or in any other case, you have no reason. The idea would be you have no reason. You're not saying something like, here's a rule: don't lie. But then you said, but what if Nazis are knocking on the door? Do you lie because you have your Jewish neighbor is hiding in the attic? And that's the idea is here is like actually that could be fine, right? You have an ethical reason here for violating an ethical rule. We can debate it, but fundamentally you're saying I have an ethical duty to save this person's life, and I have an ethical duty to tell the truth, but um, I'm going to lie and I'm going to try to do this other ethical thing. And that, right, you might say, oh, that's all fine. This person's not asserting themselves in their individuality. They're saying this is what anybody should do. They think this is just what everybody ought to do. They're still talking in terms of the ethical universal. But if you just lie to people because you want to, you're asserting yourself in your sort of your own singularity or particularity. This is one of the things that there's no easy solution to, whether you want to translate that word as particularity, singularity, individuality. It gets tricky, but it doesn't matter too much. The key one is when they say whenever the individual asserts himself, and because there's actually a word that's missing. It's this little Danish word, vil or will. Um, well, whenever the individual and they so now some later translators said, well, we don't like missing this word. So we want to bring that word back in. And so you have here's what Alistair Haney says: as soon as the individual wants to assert himself in his particularity. And Sylvia Walsh does it the same way. As soon as the single individual wants to assert himself in his particularity. Bruce Kerms also does it this way whenever the individual wants to assert himself in his particularity. I also, so I did a little search while I was here of different translations. I found that the French translations seem to make the same issue. They go straight into assertion. The Catalan, I do not know Catalan at all. I mean, my Catalan is even worse than my French, but I was able to use Google Translate. As far as I can tell, the Catalan translation also has this issue. Um, and the real problem is this. Now you've set it up as want. But here's a really basic fact. Abraham doesn't want to sacrifice Isaac. Like how so you have this problem here because you say as soon as the individual asserts himself in his singularity. Well, okay, so like murder, right? But Abraham doesn't commit murder. He never actually murders Isaac. Isaac doesn't die. And he doesn't want to either. Right? He loves Isaac. He doesn't want him to die. So what is going on here? Because it looks like actually he's off the hook by this definition because he doesn't ever actually do it. And he doesn't want to do it. And a little bit further down, there's a definition of temptation. Temptation is experiencing the desire to do the wrong thing. But now in these translations, if wanting to sin is how we sin, then temptation and sin are the same thing. Right? So if you have a felt desire to do the wrong thing, that's temptation. But wanting to do the wrong thing is also just sin. I said, well, no, this is impossible. Like, this is so muddled. This is like you can see they're attempting to correct something that was not very clear, but it's actually now less clear. So the way I solved it was to translate that little word, will, as intend. And that's, I think, on the basis of everything I've done and everybody I've talked to, that's exactly, I don't know why everybody went with want. It is what, if you were a Dane buying a dictionary at the airport, what it would tell you to do to translate that. It's similar to our in the English word will, like I will do this, I will do that, except it really means more like you are willing it, which we just don't say in English anymore. The first Kierkegaard translation um, tended to avoid this by saying something by using the locution of like he meant to, like Abraham meant to do it or something. But that's weird. Or he would do it, which is actually much worse. It's correct in an older form of English, but in contemporary English, to say that Abraham would do it is just confusing. And so what I went with is Abraham, or as soon as the individual intends to assert himself in his singularity, he sits. As soon as, and that's how you get Abraham, because Abraham does intend to do the act. He never actually does the act, and he doesn't want to do the act, but he is intending it. And that's something that we do normally think of as a crime, right? Attempted murder, intending to murder somebody is a crime a lot as just as much as murdering somebody is. And that's an example of the translation issue that you've got to get that clear because you otherwise Abraham you don't get his situation clearly because you have this whole series of things that he doesn't want to, he doesn't wish to either. So like if we're following say Aristotle, he distinguishes between different reasons for action, and wish is something that like something that you regard as your good on earth, right? And Kierkegaard consistently uses wish in that way, and he describes Isaac as Abraham's wish, right? For Abraham, that's what the good life would be, to have Isaac and to have him be healthy and flourishing and living. That's his wish for his life, his greatest wish. What he wants is, to love Isaac. He doesn't have any felt desire. And Kierkegaard is very careful to say, yeah, Abraham's not Cain, right? Cain is the first murderer, and he kills Abel because he's just jealous and pissed, right? But that's not the issue. Abraham's not here. He's not like so rage filled. It's none of these things. And yet he still intends to do it. He still intends to. And that's then I think you have to say, and this is how it gets to like what you were talking about before. Suppose that right, you're in this relationship with somebody and you believe that well, my limitations are very harmful and I don't want to harm them. I don't wish to harm them. And yet I am going to remain in this relationship. And well, now somebody might say, like, well, isn't that going to harm them? And I think now, I mean, we could spend a really long time on this, but I think it'll get like really, I don't know. At some point, I'll just end up confusing myself. Um, I've got a paper on it. So it's about to come out in the International Journal of Kierkegaard Research. And it'll explain, I guess, all the little curly cues. But I think the idea is you have to see like the paradox revolves around the fact that as you were bringing up, Abraham in this telling is absolutely intending to perform this action, which ought to result in him losing his wish, not getting anything that he wants, just destroying all the meaning of his life. And he's going to do it. But he also believes, and what he believes is that nonetheless, it'll all be fine, or better than fine. He believes that God is going to make this work. He does not know how God will make it work, and it doesn't matter to him. God will do it, and God does. But it's not so easy in the middle to think that way. Looking back, it's like, oh, and God did it. You're like, yay. Because the whole sermon took 30 minutes, and now guess what? It's all fixed. It's not that hard to wait 30 minutes for like for divine providence to swoop in, right? It's really hard and it stretches out across your life and you need to believe it. And the way that I am now thinking about it is that what is so hard is that the, the whole way we think about practical reason, um, and by we, I mean, I think something like all human beings. So, because sometimes people say, well, he's really just taking aim at enlightenment, absolutizing of reason or something. And I was like, I don't really think it's just enlightenment, absolutizing of reason. I think what is actually tripping up every person who reads Problema 1 is that we think that um, when we deliberate about action, we have to think about our actions in terms of what they are likely to affect in the world, right? As Aristotle says, practical reason is about what's up to us. And the way we figure it out is by understanding the kind of causal connections that normally exist in the world. Okay. So if I want to go and I want to call an Uber and get a ride, then I'm going to go download the app onto my phone. I'm going to be somewhere where I have a signal. I'm going to connect. I'm going to do right. And because each of these things has an expected outcome. Sometimes it doesn't work, right? Because it's only probable. For example, if I get on my phone at 4 a.m. and I call an Uber and I'm not in a big city, it's very likely I will not get anything, right? And sometimes it just might not happen because of some other reason. Who knows? Some weird thing could happen, but it's very probable. And in terms of like, for example, raising knives and stabbing people with them, like that pretty much usually kills them. Of course, it's always possible that it won't. And that's now here's the problem that Silentio, the pseudonym, brings up. He says, well, okay, when Jesus was faced by the devil and was given the three temptations, one of them was the devil took him up to the pinnacle of the temple and said, hey, throw yourself from the pinnacle of the temple because his angels will come and save you. Right. And it'll be this dramatic thing. Right. And everybody will know you're the Messiah. Okay. Because look, you threw yourself from the temple. You were saved by the angels. And Jesus says, it is written, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. Meaning, you don't go and put yourself in situations where God has to act. That's like you're trying to like force God to come to act on your behalf. And that is in Silentio's mind, he doesn't understand the difference between what Abraham did and what Jesus rejected. Right? Because Abraham's saying, I'm going to raise the knife, but I'm trusting that you, God, will somehow, it's still going to work. Practical reason, we always assume that our actions have effects and it's going to go the way it does. I raise the knife, I kill the child, and then that's what happens, right? The child is dead. There's nothing else. Um, but apparently that's not the way that Abraham is thinking. Abraham believes in God so much that God will fulfill the promise. And he's just there and he's like, I'm completely trust. I don't know. This is where you have to start filling it in. You have to figure out for Abraham what exactly is he think? Is he's just trusting like it will happen.
But I think like focusing on the causes, maybe I'm thinking about this wrong, but when you speak about this issue of causes, I think that might be twisting the story slightly. And I mean, I don't have like Kierkegaard super fresh on my mind, so I might also be misremembering because I think also even Kierkegaard does this at some point, which is like that part of the justification of Abraham would be to know that it would work out, right? That eventually something is going to happen, like you said, right? But I mean, obviously this is a bit subjective, but the way that I think is more straightforward to interpret the story is is precisely this fight between these two normative judgments upon the self, and precisely the fact that you don't know that if it's going to save the child, like because the fact that you're willing to act out this decision is precisely the problem. So, like, if you think, oh, but maybe it will work out, like maybe God will do some trickery, like that's kind of violating the initial problem, right? The problem is I'm going to do the unethical, because I'm following this higher authority. Does that make sense or no?
Yeah, so let me throw you an example and see what you think about it. Because this was my attempt to come up with an example that was very similar but different. And so you can sort of like if you think through the different one, sometimes you can try to articulate what's going on in the Abrahamic situation. I think it was probably inspired by watching House or something. So so the example is suppose that you're the parent of a child that has some, I don't know, they have some sort of problem, and it's a pretty acute health problem. And for the doctor to treat it, they're going to have to induce clinical death, right? They're going to stop the child's heart, so there won't be circulation, there won't be breathing, but only if they do that, they can perform the operation and then revive the child. And it's not 100%, but you have like the doctor is there and the doctor has all this expertise and they say, look, the child's going to die if I don't do it. If I do it, the odds of there's still a chance the child will die, but there's this very high chance. And here you can just sort of set it wherever you want. I don't remember. I mean, I guess I'm making up the example. It doesn't have to follow whatever happened on House. Um, and I don't remember what the percentage was, or if they ever discussed it. But yeah, you could say, I mean, suppose that the odds of it working out, it's like, I don't know, it's like 85%. The chance of dying without it is like over 99%. And then if you're the parent, right, I mean, you could say, I mean, oh my gosh, I'm allowing you to kill my child, but you also feel like, I don't know. I mean, I can imagine actually some parents just saying no. But I think a lot of parents would ultimately say yes. And I think the reasons why illustrate what we think is going on with Abraham, because somehow Abraham's situation is different. And the question is, what is different? So what do you think?
I would say the difference is that one of them is quantifiable and somewhat reliable, or at least the highest reliability that you can possibly get in human terms. But then with Abraham, it's like there's no possible way to make a balance of the decisions, except by the fact that one is the highest decision by definition. But then again comes the problem, which is like what you're weighing is the theological versus the ethical. And then you say the theological is higher. But then again, this whole problem that I struggle with is kind of, but the theological is almost the ethical by definition.
Yeah, it's about to take over and replace it. Right. I mean, once it comes in, it really does. It is the new ethical, right? When it shows up. Yeah, no, I mean something like that's got to be it. 'Cause you said like, well, in like it has this you can quantify it like in terms of these percentages and it's all human, it's knowable, the doctor's situation. Um, and in Abraham's situation, it's just a one-off. It's like there's nothing, it's not like this is something that God does every time. And this is where Kant goes with it too. Kant on miracles is actually really interesting because he says this is why practical reason never, he's like, you can believe that God will act, but you cannot predict when. If you could, it would just be a natural law. Okay, so like we know that God basically endorses the natural laws that govern the universe. Um, and if he wants to upset them, well, then he can. But there is no way we know. He says, except we know that he basically does the normal things, right? And only every once in a while, if ever, does he violate the normal way. And we also know that, right, he doesn't violate moral norms, which is why Kant's very down on Abraham. And he says he should have viewed it as a hallucination or a devil tempting him, uh, something like that. Because he's like, those are the things that we know. I mean, God could do something. We can't predict it. And then he says, and the way practical reason works is it always relies on this. And that's part of, I mean, we I'm not going to go into like Kant and the categorical imperative, but I mean, he thinks you have to govern your actions that way, or you're just, I mean, imagine this. I mean, here's like the worst case scenario. Like, suppose oh, I've got it. I'm like Abraham. And then you say, I'm going to go, I need to go to, okay, here's an example from another author, Elizabeth Anscombe. I love this one. She says, okay, this is in her book, Intention. She's talking about somebody's going upstairs to get the camera, and you tell them, like, oh, well, the camera is down in the basement. It's not upstairs. And they're like, yeah, I know. I'm going upstairs to get it. You tell them, like, well, there's no way to like get it from upstairs, right? There's not like some special connecting stair or something. It's not like a fireman pole that goes from upstairs down to the basement where you can get the camera. There's no way. And they're like, yeah, nonetheless, I'm going upstairs to get the camera. And she says this is an example of when somebody becomes unintelligible to us. Um, I do not know whether she had Kierkegaard in mind when she wrote that, but she did read him and she loved him. Uh, she didn't teach him or like write about him. She didn't know how to do it without ruining him. Um, but I think that in some ways that person is like is an example of how Abraham seems to us. You're like, that doesn't, the difference isn't there. There's nothing that matters here. Like, who cares if he gets the camera? But instead, it's Abraham saying, like, yeah, I'm gonna bless Abraham. I'm gonna bless Isaac. Like, how?
But am I understanding correctly that you're highlighting the incomprehensibility aspect of it? Or did I misunderstood that?
Yeah. So I went back. So, yeah, this is me going back in toward my direction of we don't see the link. We don't see the link because you're highlighting there's two norms. And I think what I'm thinking, at least today, I mean, who knows, maybe 5 years I'll have a different these things tend to percolate. Um, but in my view, if you could make out the link, it'd become like the doctor situation. And then it's not murder anymore, right? You're like, oh, it's a medical procedure. But we don't have it. There's just nothing like that there. And so it just remains what it is. Um, like I don't know. About maybe a better way of explaining it would be if we could discern the link, it would change the character of the act. But we can't. We can't see how this is connected to blessing Isaac, or this is connected to anything that would change its character as an act of attempted murder or something. And that's what locks us into fear and trembling.
Hmm. I'll give you maybe another example of how I usually interpret the story, and maybe you can tell me what you think of it. When I'm presented with Abraham's situation, usually what comes the most vivid to me in my mind is like the role of, and yeah, and this gets a little bit into utilitarianism, but that's not quite where I want to go. It's just like a rough sketch, which is like the role of a revolutionary, where you need to commit some act that is horrible, right, for a greater good. And obviously, one way to view that is unjustifiable, which is 99% of history. But let's say that to some degree, you can kind of argue for it, right? Let's say it's a one murder and it just saves all humanity in some way, right? So if that's the case, then you're again presented with these things. You have the ethical, you have the normal um, the normal situation, rule book, whatever it may be. But then there's a higher goods, which is the ultimate, and this is tricky to think about. But the way that I think about it is that that act of saving, if it's justified, that is the ultimate goods, like 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 announcing itself that this needs to be followed. It's like a notion of like eschatology. It's like this is the direction that it needs to go. If you go the highest that you can possibly go, but you need to circumvent this normal law, right? And so that's usually the way that I think about it, which is precisely and that's the dilemma. And to some degree, it is quantifiable it does have numbers to some degrees, which reminds me of your example of house, because you can ask, how many people are you going to save, how many people are you going to kill, right? It starts looking like the same. But the other hand, it kind of doesn't, because like there's no answer of what the right number is. And you just need to think, do I follow the ethic or do I follow the ultimate good that I can possibly think of? Is that does that click, or do you think it's misguided?
I mean, I mean, it makes sense. It's not how I tend to do it. I think, I don't know. I've thought a lot about that, at a different time in my life. Sort of the two theories of revolution, right? There's the theory, the Robespierrean one is like, you always do it because it's sort of this weird fact that Robespierre was against capital punishment, except during a revolution. Right. I mean, we all associate him with the terror, but he also has this like beautiful essay on like, we shouldn't practice capital punishment. But the twist is he's like, except during revolutionary conditions, because under revolutionary conditions, so much is at stake. Or in particular, I think in his mind, it's something like the fundamental grounding of all the other rules is now at stake. And when essentially in a like this moment when the earth itself is shaking, right? You don't talk about the foundation of the building. You need to make the earth stop and stand still. And until you do that, you don't even talk about like foundations of buildings. In this case, about like laws. Laws are going to come later when we establish the republic or something. And I think that that certainly makes sense. But I think the closest I get to the way you're doing it is that there's something special about killing that even if Abraham thinks, well, it'll turn out okay, there's something about killing the innocent that should be treated as an absolute. Like it's so absolute, you just can't risk it that way. You can't say, like, I think it'll come out okay. It's just not like it's so absolute that you should not harm the innocent, right? It's such an absolute thing that this idea of going in there and you're like, but that's part of what it is to like have that rule, right? Do not murder. It's like, do not murder means don't do stuff that's like kind of murdery. Don't do stuff that's like close to murder. Don't do something that might just kill somebody, right? If you turn out to be wrong. Like it's not a defense if I go out and I drive without the headlights on at night and I hit somebody. I say, well, I didn't think anybody was out. I thought it'd be fine. And it's no defense. And it's really terrible because you ought to take it's such an absolute that you just, and in particular, you might say, because it's an absolute that way, you just don't perform act types that involve killing the innocent. All right. For any reason. You don't insert that act type into your practical reasoning. Like, and I think, there's a lot to be said for that mentality that you just shouldn't do that. You should not, for any end, throw that in there. And then you're saying, like, I'm going to, and I think it'll be okay. You're like, well, you shouldn't do that. It doesn't matter if you think it'll be okay. Like you shouldn't do that. And why? And the thing that Silentio comes back to is like, it's amazing that Abraham comes back and he's just okay. Like he's okay when it's over. he's not there is a so there's a French movie, Danton, which is about this sort of final showdown between Robespierre and Danton near the end of the French Revolution. And you have this thing where eventually, of course, it leads to Danton getting killed. Um, I mean, sorry to give away the ending, but it's a French film, so it's always going to be sad. But at the end, you see like Robespierre is just sort of lying there, and he's sick. He has like a fever, but it's clear that that's not really why he's suffering. He's suffering because he's willing to do anything to establish the republic, and yet the cost is so high, and he doesn't even know if it'll happen. And you sense this on his face. He just seems like he's just in misery because what he's willing to do is so costly, and yet the end is so uncertain. And I think in that you see like there's, well, why isn't Abraham like that? And imagine it all worked out. I think you'd still, if you were Robespierre, you'd be really messed up. You'd be like, a lot of people died. You sent a lot of people to their, and even if it didn't, like, suppose that it turned out everything worked out. Danton didn't need to be killed. Your old partner. I think the fact that you were willing to kill him would wreck your relationship.
Yeah, but I think, yeah, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I think part of the problem, and this is actually not, because I think part of what justifies what you're saying is precisely the context that there's some. It's funny because to some degree, what justifies that act of like the ultimate sin of like killing the innocent is precisely that it comes from God, right? So like it's already the ultimate good, so you have to trust it. Although it's weird because then it also feel like, because something that also struggles is that to some degree I feel like the only way to get out of this is to then branch off into like epistemology, which is like, okay, is it truly from God? Like really, like you should double check. Like you should try to like think about it. Like, is God really telling you to like kill your son, right? But at the same time, if you branch that off, then I also feel like that's kind of like pulling away from the story in a way. So like I feel like there's some tension there. But anyway, but I appreciate like you kind of going back and forth about this because it's just helps me kind of like yeah, flesh out different interpretations of the story and all this. So it's very interesting and very helpful. So I don't want to get boggled down more into it. So I just we've been over for quite a while. I just wanted to get one last topic in, if that's all right with you, and if you're not pressed for time. Sweet. Um, so yeah, so I'm currently like I just joined a PhD in philosophy, and I'm working on my dissertation. And my dissertation is about psychedelics and its role in religion and how that ties into kind of the loss of meaning in modernity and how psychedelics kind of like open up this sense of the sacred. And this connects to Kierkegaard in one way, but I need to give some background context first. So a long time ago, I was kind of a coach and a personal trainer, and so I help people get fitter, stronger, and whatnot. And a lot of that is habit based. It's like you just need to eat better. You just need to go to the gym. You need to be active. You need to go for walks and whatnot. And to some degree, the standard advice is that you put small habits, small increments based on the person's current lifestyle so that they get a little bit better and a little bit better and a little bit better. And to some degree, that works fantastic. Like a lot of people get in shape precisely like that. But I've also ran into people that I worked with where that didn't work because the step was small, that it didn't justify itself. People are like, I don't really need to like, go this time for the gym. Like I can go tomorrow, right? And so there's this issue of like that every time that I tried to implement this kind of like progression, it didn't work. Um, and I kind of got this notion that for a lot of these people, what they need is not an incremental step, but it's kind of like a transformation of identity. It's like, I'm going to become the type of person that now exercises or that eats healthy or that doesn't do this and that. And that's a very different thing. It's almost the exact opposite. And that reminded me of Kierkegaard a lot, because it's this notion of the leap, right? It's like you have to, like, you can't just have this middle ground, like these in between steps. You have to leap. You don't know if you're gonna do it. Like, who knows what type of person you can do? And like, it's also a very weird thing because it's like you're gonna become a different type of person, but it's like, but you're not that person. Like, so like, how are you gonna do that, right? And the reason why this connects to psychedelics as well is because, first of all, they have this transformative aspect. It's like, people are severely depressed and whatnot, and then they certainly have this notion of sacredness, and it's just kind of they turn their lives around. And it's also, I also find it very interesting because it's very, one of the shining examples of psychedelic treatment in the context of therapy. One is depression, but the other one is addiction. And addiction has this notion of like that it's kind of like a restriction of possibility. It's almost like a demon is like constraining you like further and further where you don't have agency. And they know it's bad for them, right? So like you can't tell an addict that like, heroin is awful for you. Like just quit. Like it's not, just like Kierkegaard said, like it's not a notion of knowledge. Like it's not a Socratic, thing. It's like you need to change who you are. You need to take a leap. But people can't take that leap. But then somehow in psychedelics, something happens, whatever it is, and people sometimes do make that leap. And so I plan to, I'm going to try to use this notion of Kierkegaard to kind of try to explain this aspect that happens in psychedelic therapy, where it's like it's you have all the knowledge, but you just can't take it. And so there's an act of faith that you eventually just jump into it. And so I know this is a bit messy because I'm still working all this out in my head, but I just wanted to get the opportunity, since I'm with a Kierkegaard, scholar, to either critique if you think there's some aspects that just don't match, and so I avoid some pitfalls, or maybe some other related aspects that you think kind of might be useful to like explore this line of thought.
Yeah, I haven't thought too deeply about psychedelics, except in the context of Philip K. Dick. Um, but that's not a happy story about it. I don't know if you're familiar with much of his later writing. Most people, if they know things, they know the ones that are made into movies, like Blade Runner, um, Minority Report, um, Total Recall. I mean, there's a million of these things. Strangely, it's actually his less effective stories that get made into the best movies. His best novels, you almost feel like they couldn't possibly be movies, because they are very much sort of tied up in the nature of perception of reality. And there's always an ongoing problem about discerning what's real. And there's often an issue of somebody having to figure out whether some unusual experience is revelatory or madness, or something, or something else.
Yeah. Just before you go on, sorry to interrupt, but I just want to make sure that we stay online, because I recognize that psychedelics is kind of a niche topic. So obviously not everyone has explored that a lot, but also like I think this can apply beyond psychedelics. So I actually have a book here. What is it? So for example, because I think you can replace psychedelics with like transformative experiences in general. So like L.A. Paul has this great book, yeah, transformative. And you can also just think about mystical experiences in general. So like even though I'm interested in psychedelics because it's something that you can induce to help people and it's like a treatment, you can also kind of make the same argument of like if people just somehow had a spontaneous mystical experience or religious experience.
Yeah. No, so I was just throwing that out there because it's really the only time I've really thought about it. Because at some point, the thing is, he only had one experience in which he took a psychedelic, and he had this sort of amazing, intense experience of God um, coming to him, and he believes that it was like Jesus telling him essentially that his sins were forgiven. And it was this like, it just completely blew his mind. Unfortunately, I mean, he had a lot of problems in his life, and it didn't seem to lead to correction, but it did lead to a major change in him, that he had that. But I mean, I don't think that that helps me to get to what you're talking about. But so I'll talk about the leap, because I think that's right. There's a sense in which for Kierkegaard, people, we always talk about the leap of faith, but that's one kind of leap. There's lots of leaps. There's like the leap into addiction, right? He would say, and I think he thinks that all sin is sort of like this, that there's a freedom at the beginning. You leap in, but once you leap into the identity, you realize you can't leap out. Now the leap out wouldn't be the leap of faith, and you need some extra resource to make that possible, and it's not easy to see how. Right? You do need some total change, and he's very interested in that dynamic you're talking about too. About sometimes the iterative thing is what you need, and other times you need that change in your sense of your whole self. You need to see that self that goes to the gym as a real possibility, right? Or in my case, the self who uses the treadmill, right? I only just started in January. It was because I had some friends who were doing the Murph Challenge, which, if you're not familiar with it, it's this thing where you run 1 mile, you do 100 pull-ups, 200 push-ups, 300 squats, and then you run another mile. Now, as it happened, I ended up getting injured, and then I recovered, and then I had another problem at the end. So I never made it all the way, but I went into it and I said, you know what? I'm middle-aged. I want to live a longer, healthier life. I want to be this other kind of person. And, I was able to actually, and I was sort of shocked. Like all of a sudden I was like, I can run a mile. Like, where did this come from? And a lot of that was, in the past, I tried to fool myself into it, be like, well, if I give myself something very entertaining to do, then I'll do it. Well, then really what I'm doing is I'm still just trying to entertain myself or something, and it's basically laziness, and that's not going to lead to like actually exercising. Um, so I mean that's a long way of saying, like, I think you're right in casting it that way. I think that's how Kierkegaard sees it. You need the leap, but I don't know how to say anything helpful about the way a specific experience feeds into it, except that I think that's got to be right. That like a specific experience could be the thing that shifts your sense of what's possible for you to be, right? I mean, and sometimes it's a normal experience, and sometimes it could be something completely different. But I'll add this one thing is that you might think that Kierkegaard would have something to say about mystical experiences, but actually he really doesn't. He seemed not to have had one himself, and so he didn't, I think, want to talk much about it. Um, and so there's a kind of lacuna there that it seems as like he ought to have a room for how that would work. But I don't think he ever filled in that hole. So if you wanted to work on that, it would be sort of filling in. You could use his resources, but I think there's nothing that speaks directly to it, because he just never had a mystical experience of that kind.
Yeah, yeah, that's quite interesting. But another area that I was thinking that might provide an easier link is like even if you like discount mystical experiences, like another way to think about it is this is who you are, this is who you can be, this is who you know you should be, but you just can't bridge it. Like the addict doesn't want to be an addict, right? And through the experience, you have a sense of the sacred, and that is somehow embedded in your ability to make that leap of faith. I think you can still have that framework, but take the experience out. Because I think part of the problem with modernity is the fact that precisely that the sacred isn't mystical, but often requires a mystical experience to recognize the sacred, just because culture is so secular that the very notion of sacredness like this doesn't make sense. But I don't think that the mystical experience is where the thing is. Like the sacred is in the world. It is reality. You just need to look at it. And so I view psychedelics and mystical experience as just like a door that just pops out to you that then you can go through. But the sacred is, I think, what's important. And then you can see that in Kierkegaard as well, because it's the exact same problem, right? It's like, this is who I am. I'm stuck in the finite, let's say. I could be somewhere else. There's possibility. I have the knowledge, but I can't take the leap of faith. And my leap of faith relies on God, the sacred. Like it's the exact same thing, no?
So let me see if I've got this right. When you're describing, it sounds like the way you're describing it is that really there's something that's just there all the time, and you could come to recognize it in different ways. But the key thing is coming to recognize that it is there, whether or not that's right, the sacred.
Well, I would say that's like somewhat basic theology, right? Like God is in the world. You just need to, have a relationship, however you want to put it, right? But it's not it doesn't require a mystical experience. Like no other theologian has thought that.
Yeah, no. So I'm just trying to figure out, like, so the way that the mystical experience or the psychedelic experience comes in is to induce the recognition.
Yeah, yeah. To make it like a real possibility for you, right? Like because the typical context is like new atheists, like the world is just a place of objects, and they have a psychedelic experience. Actually, no, there's something to this notion of sacred, is even though I can't quite pin it, and that makes it real, and then that affords all kinds of possibilities that include transformation.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I'd say, like, actually the one thing that comes to mind to me is Mike Tyson, who I don't know if you how familiar you are uh with his story, right? But when he was a great boxer, the heavyweight champion of the world. He famously had a showdown with AJ Ayer at one point, um, which is sort of funny because it's hard to imagine AJ Ayer being brave enough to stand up to Mike Tyson. Um, but when Tyson went to prison, right, he had an experience there, but then he also had a psychedelic experience, and they had the same import for him, which was that he was an egomaniac. He was a complete monster, right? He realized that his whole life was just feeding his ego, that he was a terrible person, and essentially the psychedelic experience just helped him to recognize this about himself, and that it was possible not to be ego driven. Right, which is a reason why, I mean, sort of Mike Tyson after all of this is just not the same person, right? You would say, because he was this person who before he would say, in his whole mentality, all he wanted to do was destroy people. That and that made him a great boxer, and a terrible person. But both prison and the psychedelic experience taught him, like, it's not all about your ego. There's more out there. Um, and I think that I mean, that's an interesting sort of side to it. If you get something, because like the idea is that there's something that's just there, but you don't see it, you don't recognize it, or I mean, certainly people had told him, like, you're not the only person, it's not all about you, but it made no difference to him, right? It didn't make because he's like, well, I'm just gonna go, I'm just gonna, like, I don't know what his mentality. I mean, did he want to punch the world? Did he want to, like, what did he want to do? But he wanted to make the world, like, submit somehow, right? And then he realized, like, I don't have to do that. I don't have to live like that. I could do something else. Um, yeah, so I don't think I have anything, like, deep. But I think, I mean, that gets into, I mean, there's at least two sides to it, because if you think about, like, normally Kierkegaard thinks we make progress by, for example, by becoming more self-aware of our despair. And that can involve, right, sometimes you really need, like, a new experience to see how to get that deeper perspective, to realize, like, oh my God, the way I'm, like, pursuing my life is just fundamentally wrong. And to see that, and then to see the true possibility finally as something valuable and good, right, can require like something to happen to you, something to give you a new perception. Um, I don't know. I'm just trying to think my way through concept of anxiety, where he talks about the leap. Um, because the way he does it there, though, he always seems to portray it as this like diminishing returns kind of business, right? That you have the most freedom at the beginning, and then it's sort of your freedom is just sort of as you leap into narrower and narrower spots. And of course, part of that has to do with some weird way that concept of anxiety is set up, because it's meant to leave you in a very anxious state, in which you're very unsure, like, well, how do I ever get out of it now that I screwed it up? And the answer is, something like the leap of faith. Faith is the only thing that can conquer this. But he doesn't dwell on the conditions when that could actually happen.
So what would be the Kierkegaard answer of, let's say, an addict doesn't want to be an addict. He has all the knowledge he wants. He just can't. He and Kierkegaard can even say, let's say a conversation between Kierkegaard and the addict, and then the Kierkegaard says, "You have to make the leap of faith," and then the addict says, "How can I do that?" What would be Kierkegaard's answer?
I think number one would be something like, yeah, you can't. Yeah, you can't. You can't. And here's the so I'm going to go to one of his very latest writings on an upbuilding discourse. And I think it's the second time he comes back to this figure who's unnamed in the Bible, except as the woman who is a sinner, which right, the idea is she shows up. Jesus is at this dinner with the Pharisees, and she shows up and she's just crying and upset, and she comes to him, and the Pharisee who's there is like, this guy's no prophet. This woman's a famous sinner, and he's like letting her like, hang all over him. And Jesus does this thing about, well, if one person had a small debt forgiven and another person had a greater debt forgiven, who do you think would love more? And he's like, well, the Pharisee says, the one who had the greater debt. And he's like, yeah, exactly. And he says, daughter, your sins are forgiven. And that figure, I think, is Kierkegaard's model. Like he says, it's actually really important that she doesn't get named, because she's actually a model for every person. If she had a name, we would treat it as specific to her, but that is like the ground level that person needs to be at. What is it, and what is it that she does? And I mean, she's not there making herself righteous, but she is simply out of a sense of, and this is where it gets into this complicated thing. Is it because she feels that Jesus would love her? Does she love him because she thinks he would love her, and then he does love her, and then she loves him more? It's something like, and what she does is this sort of movement of being willing to come out into the open in order to be loved. Okay, there we go. Yeah, the outlet is iffy. Yep. So I'm switching over to the phone.
No worries, no worries. You were talking about, kind of like, if I understood correctly, what made the woman like approach Jesus? Kind of like, I suppose maybe one way to think about it is kind of like what prompted this initial encounter, I suppose.
Yeah. Um, I think okay, yeah, that's right. Right. And I think that in terms of sort of escaping out of something, because I think she too would feel that her whole life was just, she'd lost control, and she had no other identity that she felt she could get to. And
yet there was this sense in which the experience of being loved gave her the capacity to love, which led to her experiencing greater love, which also gave right there's some sort of chain reaction there, which is really a movement through that. And but now that I say that, I'm not sure whether or not this is uh, I haven't thought about this enough to be able to spell it out, because I think that where you started is right in terms of possibility, and right, and for Kierkegaard, that is the key thing, is that um, if you can recognize something as a possible self, then you can leap toward that self if you have that real sense that it's possible. And I mean, and in her case, what she needed was the sense that she was capable of being loved or something like that. I mean, she must have believed that it wasn't even possible for somebody like her to be loved, and yet she was, and that transformed her. And I think Kierkegaard thinks that ought to be sort of the ground level of how people can be transformed, is if they don't have the sense that they are lovable um, in some sense. I mean, maybe lovable despite not being lovable. You know, there's something paradoxical about it. She doesn't think that she's anything great, but she knows that she is loved, and that itself makes her embark on this. I don't know, this leap, this take this risk. And I think that those are the two sides of it. Philosophically, possibility is what you need. Um, but I think also to recover yourself after losing yourself in the sense of believing that you're worthless, you need the experience of being loved.
Yeah. Does Kierkegaard ever make this explicit connection of love and kind of the leap of faith, or are you just like hypothesizing about it?
I mean, he might, but the problem is that I've never read that thing carefully. And so it only came to mind because I do think that he means her to be, and he says, well, I mean, he says she's the prototype for every Christian. Um, so that's not theoretical, but since I haven't ever read through it carefully, I'm not that sure how it fits in. But I think that's how it could.
Because I think this is quite interesting because it does connect a lot to to the framework that I typically use. Because I think what I think what allows transformation, like I think in a lot of times very Platonic and Neoplatonic terms, but I think what allows that transformation is like being in contact with the good. Like the good transforms you. Like God like that's just it's almost the entire pinnacle of like Western philosophy and theology. And so that makes total sense on the on the story of Jesus of the woman of the sinner. It's like through the contact with the ultimate good, then she's transformed. And I think that's exactly what happens in a psychedelic experience as well. Um, which is like people do have a sense that there is such a thing as the ultimate good, like that place, that the world isn't just a nihilistic place of random atoms in some way, even if they can't comprehend it, and that is somehow tied to this notion of possibility. But it's not. I know we're moving kind of in very theological terms, but I'm not sure if I can quite make the explicit connection of like why does the ultimate good have that transformative power? Or yeah, let's leave it at that. There's other things, but this is getting very theological. I don't want to make the conversation super long.
Yeah, and I think that there's something mysterious about that. And maybe that's I think it may even be the case that if you are Kierkegaard, you're going to say, yeah, it is mysterious. It will be mysterious because you're not good. I mean, if we were in the state in which we'd already been transformed fully, maybe we would understand the effect of the good on us. But I think there's something about there's something in us that responds to it. It's the same thing that gives us the capacity to love others. Um, and yet we just don't understand it. We don't understand how it functions. Um, and that's again, that's why it's a leap of faith. Um, how could the person who's not good understand the good more than a little? And I think that mystery is just going to be left there. It's like that's what it is. Um, and if you can get that sense, you can make that leap. Although you could also refuse. I mean, somebody could refuse to do it, and then I don't know. That's always a very sad thing to see somebody on the edge of getting out, and then maybe they say, "But I prefer to remain an addict." Um, and they probably don't say it that way, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, if you've seen it, you know what I mean. That there's a sense in which somebody can come right up to the edge.
Yeah, that's true. Um, yeah, and so I want to wrap this up, even though I could go for this for hours and hours, but I want to respect your time. So this was super fascinating. I loved it. I think Kierkegaard is truly one of the most. It's it's not only like a very powerful thinker, like in terms of like intellect, but I think it's also one of the few. I don't know. It's one of the few thinkers where I feel like there's kind of like the heavy philosophy plus the beautiful plus the like very pragmatic practical things that you need to just run your life, and like Kierkegaard is just like managing all these things all at once, and so it's just fascinating. And yeah, and I think kind of like your comments and your interpretations were super useful, very fascinating. So yeah, it was just truly a pleasure, and I'm very thankful that you wanted to come on.
You know, I'm so glad that you invited me. I love chatting about Kierkegaard and about any random thing. And you know, I try not to indulge my own random interests too frequently. But let me bring in one last bit of wisdom. This time from Mike Tyson. He did have this little saying too about, and I think it's very Kierkegaardian. And I think initially when he gave this advice, he meant it literally, but later he meant it figuratively. And he said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And I think it's really true. And you know, that's the transformative experience. Punches you in the face.
True, true, true. So yeah, thank you once again. It was a pleasure, and have a great day.
All right, you too.
All right,
Bye.
cheers. All right.